61 degrees. Caleb Orr touched the little brass thermometer beside the window, then shut his field ledger with 2 fingers. He did not need another note. The house had already answered. Outside, the January blizzard of 1891 was entering its 9th morning. It was no longer weather. It had become weight. Roads had disappeared. Roof lines had folded into white mounds. The North Pass was sealed shut behind 40 feet of drifted snow. Below him, Bitterroot Basin had almost vanished. But 54 feet above the frozen floor, under a black stone overhang, Caleb's cliff house still held warmth. Inside, the fire breathed steadily. Miriam stirred barley soup over the stove. Their daughter Nora slept under 2 patched wool blankets. The old dog Finch lay beside her cot with his nose tucked beneath his tail. A pair of mittens hung on a cedar peg near the sun bench. They were already dry. No shouting, no panic. No furniture shoved against doors. No smoke rolling back into the room. Only the wind outside, clawing at a house it could not understand. Caleb stepped closer to the narrow mica-paned window and looked down. The basin below was nothing but white pressure and buried chimneys. And somewhere under that whiteness were the people who had laughed at him. The warmth behind his ribs suddenly felt less like comfort than accusation. How many of them were still alive? 2 years earlier, Bitterroot Basin had looked like the future. New cabins stood along the freight road. Sawyers cut pine from dawn until dark. Men in wool coats gathered outside the store and talked about rail spurs, ore claims, livery stables, and money that had not yet arrived but already seemed promised. Caleb Orr arrived with less confidence than most of them. He was not a speculator. He had spent 15 years building culverts, mine portals, and stone bridge piers across the Northern Territories. He knew how frost moved through rock. He knew why a wall failed at the corner first. He knew that a crack was not just damage. It was a sentence written before the collapse. While other men walked the basin floor searching for flat parcels, Caleb kept looking up. The basin had grass. It had water. It had road frontage. It also had a shape that troubled him. The valley floor cupped the cold. The north wind entered through the pass and had nowhere to spend itself. Snow that fell from the ridges did not leave quickly. It gathered. It settled. It waited. Above town, a broken band of basalt ran along the western wall. Most settlers saw useless cliff. Caleb saw height, shadow, drainage, stone mass, and one narrow ledge tucked beneath an overhang that kept the old snow bare, even in March. The land clerk sold it to him for $11. He tried not to smile while writing the receipt. "You planning to farm the clouds?" the clerk asked. Caleb folded the paper and put it in his coat. "No," he said, "just planning to stay dry." By supper, the story had reached half the basin. By the following Sunday, almost everyone had named the place Fool's Shelf. It sounded like a joke, and that was the point. The trail to it was steep enough to make a mule think twice. There was no field, no barn site, no easy well, no place for a porch wide enough to impress a visitor. From below, the ledge did not look like a homestead. It looked like a dare. Miriam felt the laughter before Caleb did. At the mercantile, talk dropped whenever she stepped inside. Women who had once made room for her at the counter suddenly found the flour sacks interesting. Children repeated words they had heard at supper tables and then hid behind skirts when she turned around. Nora heard one of them say it first. "Fool's girl." That evening, Miriam told Caleb while she mended a sleeve by lamplight. He listened without interrupting. Then he rose, took his ledger, and walked outside. The sun had just left the ridge. Cold blue shadow spread over the basin floor. Caleb stood under the overhang and measured how the evening wind moved along the stone face. Far below, lanterns blinked to life in town. Above them, the ledge stayed still. Caleb wrote down one number, then another. He did not write what he felt. He wrote what the mountain did. Construction began in spring when the trail thawed and the mud below was still trying to become road. The ledge refused every easy idea. A normal cabin would have been faster. 4 timber walls, a peaked roof, a stovepipe, and enough optimism to call it finished. Caleb wanted something slower. He cut into the cliff instead of building out from it. He used the overhang as a roof shield. He set stone where wind would hit. He laid timber only where timber made sense, then protected it like something fragile, because in that country it was. Every room had to be earned. At dawn, the Basin could hear his hammer. Not loud, not dramatic, just patient. Tap, chip, measure, listen. He shaped a storm throat before the main door, a small angled entry that forced wind to turn twice before it could reach the living room. He carved a shallow scupper along the outer ledge so rain and meltwater would be led away before it found the threshold. He set the stove against a wall of dark stone that could drink heat all afternoon and give it back after sunset. For the smoke vent, he did the strangest thing of all. He refused to send it straight up. Instead, the flue climbed, turned, narrowed, and exited beneath the lip of the overhang at an angle that made the town carpenter squint. "Smoke likes a straight road," the carpenter said. Caleb rubbed soot from his thumb. "So does wind." That was all he offered. Their mule, Button, hauled lime, iron, hinges, cedar planks, mica sheets, sacks of flour, and more stone tools than any neighbor thought one man needed. Miriam worked beside him until her hands changed. They lost their schoolroom softness. Mortar dried in the cracks. Lime roughened her knuckles. She learned how wet a joint should sound when a stone seated properly. Nora stacked offcuts by color. Finch supervised from whichever patch of dust seemed most inconvenient. By autumn, Fool's Shelf had stopped looking like a mistake. Not from the valley floor. From there, it still looked impossible. But up close, beneath the basalt lip, the house seemed less built than uncovered. A narrow face of stone and timber, a door tucked out of the wind, small windows that caught low winter sun, a ledge that drained before it drowned. Men climbed up sometimes just to prove they were not afraid of the trail. They asked Caleb why the house had no broad roof. Overhang already has one. Why the door turned sideways. Wind. Why the bench along the inner wall was black stone instead of wood. Heat. Why the vent bent like a lame elbow. Smoke needs to leave. Wind needs to fail. Most left more irritated than informed. It is hard to laugh at a man who refuses to argue back. At the bottom of the basin, Everett Pike had no such problem. Pike owned the largest mill between Bitterroot and the rail depot. By 1889, half the buildings in town had his boards in their walls. He was heavy-set, quick with a handshake, and careful to make sure every public success reflected back on him. That year, he began work on the Basin House, a 3-story lodging hall meant to impress freight men, investors, and traveling merchants. It had a long front porch, tall windows, carved railings, and a roofline that looked grand from the road. The first estimate was $4,600. By Christmas, Pike had spent more and seemed pleased by it. When men praised the building, he pointed up toward Caleb's ledge and laughed. "Now that," he said, "is what happens when a mason forgets he isn't a bird." The joke traveled fast. So did the comparison. Pike was building the basin's future. Caleb was hiding in a wall. But the mountain did not count applause. It counted load. The first test came with rain. In September, a cold 3-day storm struck the ridge and poured down the basalt like water from a broken barrel. The basin floor turned to black paste. Wagon wheels sank to their hubs. Creek banks failed and carried fence rails away. Caleb did not sit inside admiring his work. He stood outside in oilskin and watched. Water struck the overhang, broke, ran along the outer face, and searched for weaknesses. Some of it found the ledge. Then the scupper caught it. A thin, angry stream curved around the entry and fell harmlessly into the air. Inside, Miriam placed a basin near the door out of habit. By the third morning, it was still empty. Caleb recorded the rainfall, wind direction, threshold condition, and interior dampness. No speech, no celebration. One rainstorm proved only that one rainstorm had been understood. Winter was less forgiving. The first cold season exposed the flaw. It began quietly. A folded blanket near the pantry kept coming away clammy. Then, a strip of wall cloth behind the flour bin darkened at the edges. One morning, Miriam moved a tin cup and found cold beads of water trembling on the shelf beneath it. The roof was sound. The stone did not leak. The fire was strong. But water was appearing where no water should have been. That bothered Caleb more than mockery ever had. For 3 nights, he studied his own house as if it belonged to an enemy. He hung strips of linen in different corners. He moved the thermometer from the floor to the wall to the pantry shelf. He carried a candle slowly along the stone and watched the flame lean. By the 4th morning, the answer was plain. Warm room air drifted into the back pantry, met a cold pocket in the cliff wall, and gave up its moisture. The house had not failed. But it had lied to him once, and once was enough. The repair made no sense to visitors. Caleb tore out shelving that had taken 2 days to fit. He cut a deeper cold well into the lowest corner of the floor. He added a hidden drain groove behind the pantry wall and hung a wool baffle several inches off the stone so still air could gather between cloth and rock. Miriam moved stores without complaint. Nora asked if the house was broken. Caleb sat back on his heels, covered in stone dust. "No," he said. "It's teaching." 2 weeks later, the shelf stayed dry. The blanket dried in one afternoon. The pantry stopped sweating. Caleb wrote the correction into the ledger beside the earlier mistake, because a record that hides its failures is only a boast with pages. By the second winter, even the oldest carpenter in town stopped laughing. An old man named Judd Voss climbed the trail after hearing that Caleb burned less than half the wood most Basin cabins needed. He tested the stone bench with his palm. He stood in the storm throat while Miriam opened and closed the inner door. He watched smoke draw through the dogleg vent while wind pushed snow sideways across the ledge. Then Caleb handed him the ledger. Judd turned page after page. Temperatures, fuel loads, wind directions, moisture notes, repairs. When he gave the book back, his face had changed. Not convinced exactly, but emptied of easy jokes. Numbers had a way of ending conversations the mouth wanted to continue. In late autumn of 1890, small signs began arriving ahead of the storm. The elk came down early. Not one or two, but whole bands moving through scrub below the pine line before the grass had fully died. Jays cached seed as if they were being paid by the hour. The creek froze in thin plates before November was ready for it. Caleb watched all of it. So did an old Shoshone packer named Talon Gray, who stopped at the store one afternoon, looked north toward the pass, and said, "The wind has found a door." Most men pretended not to hear him. Everett Pike smiled into his coffee. "Wind comes every year." Talon did not answer. Caleb remembered. By the first week of December, Fool's shelf looked less like a home than a careful inventory. Dried apples hung in cloth bags. Beans filled 2 nail kegs. Lamp oil sat in a rear niche away from sparks. Salt pork, flour, oats, candles, extra wicks, and 2 coils of rope had places assigned to them before they were needed. No one admired it from the road. A storage wall has no porch railings. A full flour bin does not make a town feel prosperous. Down in the Basin, Pike kept building. The Basin house took on more windows, more rooms, and a second dining space for the travelers he expected in spring. Men praised the height of it. Women admired the glass. Merchants said a town with a building like that could not help but grow, and for a time, it was easy to believe them. 2 investments were rising in the same valley. One was built to be seen. The other was built to be used when seeing was impossible. Winter would decide which mattered. The first snow of January seemed ordinary. Children packed it into balls near the schoolhouse. Freight wagons still crossed the Basin Road. Smoke rose from chimneys in clean gray ribbons. The mill saw ran through the morning, and the Basin house served stew to 6 travelers waiting for the pass to improve. Then the snow kept falling. By the second day, fences had shortened. By the third, front doors opened into trenches. By the fourth, the North Pass had vanished. The storm did not sweep through. It sat down. Wind poured from the mountains and packed snow against every vertical surface it could find. The basin floor, shaped like a bowl, began filling like one. Houses that had seemed sturdy in November now stood half-buried beneath a weight they had never been designed to carry. The first chimneys failed on the fifth day. Snow capped them from above, while wind drove smoke back down through the flues. Families opened doors to breathe and lost heat so fast water froze in basins. They closed doors to stay warm and coughed until their eyes burned. There was no safe choice. The pass was gone. The road was gone. The town was becoming rooms under snow. At Fool's Shelf, the storm struck differently. Wind hit the cliff face and split around the overhang. Snow flew past the ledge instead of settling against the door. The angled entry held. The scupper stayed open where it mattered. Firewood stacked beneath the rock lip remained dry. And from the bent vent, smoke kept leaving. Not bravely, not magically, correctly. On the seventh night, the Basin house began to fail. The tall windows that had looked so handsome in autumn took the wind hard. Snow climbed the porch posts and pressed against the lower walls until the glass bowed in its frames. Near midnight, one upstairs beam cracked. Guests woke shouting. A section of ceiling sagged under the packed snow above it. Men shoved furniture against the wall as if a table could argue with a mountain. Pike ordered everyone into the dining room, then into the kitchen when the north wall began to complain. By morning, one corner of the roof had caved in. Snow poured through the opening and lay across the hallway like a white animal. Pike's youngest daughter, Clara, had been coughing since the fourth day. Now she lay wrapped in a quilt beside the stove, lips pale, breath thin. Everett Pike fed the fire until the stove sides glowed dull red. The kitchen still grew colder. For the first time in years, he stopped calculating what something was worth. The porch, the rooms, the tall windows, the carved railings, the building everyone had admired. None of it could keep the wall from bending. None of it could make smoke rise through a blocked flue. None of it could hold the roof against weight it had never been taught to carry. Above the basin, Caleb woke before dawn on the 9th day and touched the thermometer again. 60 lenses. Miriam was ladling soup. Nora was still asleep. Finch lifted his head when the wind struck the outer wall, then decided the matter did not concern him and put it down again. The house was not comfortable because the storm was small. It was comfortable because every weakness had been given a job. The overhang kept snow from the entry. The storm throat broke the draft. The dark stone bench held yesterday's heat. The wool baffle stopped the pantry wall from sweating. The cold well took moisture where it belonged. The dog-leg vent let smoke leave while the wind searched for a straight path and found none. Small decisions, all of them carrying weight. Miriam joined Caleb at the window. For a long time, neither spoke. Only a few chimney tips showed in the basin below. Then Miriam said, very softly, "There are children under that." Caleb kept his hand on the window frame. The house had passed its test. Now the people inside it would be tested. Near dawn, the wind weakened. The silence after 9 days of blizzard felt wrong, as if the world had gone deaf. Caleb was already moving. He took the hemp rope from its peg. Miriam packed sacks with bread, dried apples, strips of pork, and 2 blankets. Nora, sleepy and frightened, folded cloths without being asked. Finch stood at the door, whining low in his throat. Outside, the Basin had become a different country. No streets, no fences, no yards, only humps, ridges, torn roof edges, and chimneys like black pins stuck in a white map. Caleb tied the rope around his waist before descending. The snow had hardened in places and collapsed in others. Each step could hold or betray him. Finch found the first family. The dog stopped over a drift that showed no roofline, no door, no sign of life. He sniffed, circled, and began clawing at the snow. Caleb drove the probe down. Nothing. He shifted 3 feet and tried again. Wood. Then, beneath the windless cold, a sound. One knock from below. By noon, Caleb and Miriam had opened a tunnel to the Ingram cabin. 4 people came out blinking into daylight, their faces gray with smoke and hunger. The youngest boy could not walk. Miriam wrapped him and carried him against her chest. The search continued for 3 days. One family was found in a root cellar beneath a collapsed shed. 2 brothers had survived by breaking through the wall between their cabin and the empty storehouse next door. An old widow was found under her kitchen table where a ceiling beam had fallen across the room, but missed her by less than a foot. Some doors opened, some did not. By the 3rd evening, Caleb's hands were split at the knuckles, and Miriam's voice was raw from calling through snow. 14 people had been pulled out alive. 22 more had found shelter inside the cliff house. Every floor space was used. Children slept near the warm stone bench. Men who had laughed at Caleb passed soup bowls in silence. Miriam counted blankets, then counted them again. Nora gave her cot to Clara Pike and slept beside Finch on a folded coat. No one called it Fool's Shelf that night. Or if they did, they said it differently. Everett Pike was among the last found alive. The Basin house still showed one broken gable above the snow, but most of the grand front had collapsed inward. Caleb cut through a drift near the kitchen door and heard coughing before he saw faces. Pike stared at him when the opening widened. His beard was iced white. His hands shook. Clara lay behind him, barely awake. For 2 years, Pike had always known what to say. Now he had nothing. Caleb reached into the dark room. "Hand me the child first." That was the whole conversation. The climb back to the ledge took nearly an hour. Pike slipped twice and once went to his knees, not from injury, but from exhaustion. Halfway up, he looked at the house beneath the black overhang. Smoke rose from the bent vent in a steady gray thread. Light showed in the small windows. The door was clear. The ledge was clear. The thing he had mocked looked less like defiance now than mercy built in advance. The mountain had delivered its answer. Spring did not arrive quickly. The storm ended in January, but walls of snow remained in the shaded draws until the first green shoots had already appeared elsewhere. As the basin thawed, the cost surfaced. 6 graves were dug on the south rise. 6 names became part of the town's winter. The number could have been worse, and everyone knew it. That knowledge changed the way people looked at Fool's Shelf. It did not become beautiful. It became undeniable. In April, the town gathered near the damaged Basin house. The porch was gone. One wing had to be torn down. The tall windows had been boarded over, and the carved railings lay in a heap of broken pride beside the road. Everett Pike stood in front of the crowd with his hat in both hands. He looked smaller than he had before winter. Not poorer, not even weaker, just less certain. He glanced up toward the ledge. "When Caleb Orr began that house," he said, "I thought strength was something you could see from the road." No one laughed. I was wrong. The words did not fix what had happened, but they made room for the lesson to stand where pride had been. Caleb did not give a speech. He placed his ledger on a table. That was enough. People opened it expecting secrets and found work. Temperature records, rain notes, smoke observations, fuel measurements, moisture failures, pantry repairs, wind angles, supply counts, storm notes, names of the rescued, names of the dead. The house had not survived because one man was stubborn. It had survived because one man had let the place correct him before the storm could punish him. That was harder for the town to understand than stonework. By the next winter, changes had begun. A storm room was cut into the basalt outcrop behind the store. Several new cabins were built with lower roofs and protected entries. Chimneys were raised, braced, and given caps shaped for wind instead of pride. Families stored more food than they used to and stopped apologizing for it. Everett Pike rebuilt the Basin house, but not as before. The new building was lower. Its windows were smaller. Its roof carried less vanity and more sense. Behind it, at his own expense, Pike ordered a public shelter cut into the rock. When asked why, he usually gave one answer: "I already paid for the lesson." Years passed. Nora grew tall enough to read Caleb's old ledger without standing on a stool. She learned where snow gathered first and why a drywall could still sweat. She learned that a chimney was not a hole for smoke, but a negotiation with air. She learned that stone remembered heat, water followed laziness, and wind punished straight lines. Finch grew old by the stove. Button stopped hauling and spent his last summers in a fenced patch below the trail. Miriam's hands never went soft again. The basin changed. The mountain did not. Blizzards still came from the north. Snow still searched for roofs to burden. Wind still pushed against every bad assumption men nailed into wood. But under the black stone overhang, the cliff house remained. Visitors climbed to see it years later. Some admired the view. Some admired the labor. Some ran their hands along the storm throat and asked why the door turned before it opened. If Nora was there, she answered the way her father once had: "Wind." Then she showed them the ledger. Near the entry, Caleb eventually carved a short line into the stone lintel. Not large, not polished, just deep enough to hold shadow when the afternoon sun moved across it. It read, "Stone hears first." The lesson was never that Caleb had beaten winter. No one beats winter in the mountains. The lesson was that the mountain had spoken for years before the storm arrived, in snow pockets, wet corners, bent smoke, early elk, and cold wind through the pass. Most people heard inconvenience. Caleb heard instruction. And when the white weight finally came down on Bitterroot Basin, it did not care who had been mocked, who had been rich, who had been certain, or who had built the grandest porch. It only cared what had been prepared to listen.